once I come and I plunder your country, I've got to justify it. And the way I justify it is I say, well, you know, they're not really human.
Usually, when we think of the word science, we envision a scientist using logic, experiments, and observations to make conclusions about natural phenomena. And most of the time, our envisioning would be accurate. But there was a time, not too long ago, when the vision of science was purposefully blurred in order to produce so-called scientific facts about human relationships. The relationship in question produced the concept of race, that is, the categorization of humans based on physical characteristics, primarily skin color, and the methods used are today known as scientific racism.
The whole premise of scientific racism, first of all, is an oxymoron. Science and racism, the two cannot run together. That's a contradiction. Racism is a social, political, economic system of dominance and control. Science, where that comes in, pseudoscience, and that's all we're talking about, is where one group, in this case Caucasians historically, have said, okay, because of a certain color, because of a certain hair texture, because of a certain shape of the head, because of body type, that there's an inferiority on that group, and the group, of course, being those of Negroid or Africoid ancestry. Because of the way they look, because of their physical type, and supposedly their mental capacity or lack thereof, therefore there is a basis and a premise for control, dominance, and superiority and supremacy for one race. That is the pseudo-scientific racism.
To fully understand scientific racism, we have to examine the origins of the notion of race itself, and to do that, we should first look at how Europeans in the ancient world categorized different peoples, what characteristics they assigned to them, and for what philosophical or scientific reason. One key factor for categorization was slavery. In the ancient world, slavery was not based on race. The term had not been invented yet, but rather circumstance. One could be a prisoner of war, a member of a rival religion, or drowning in poverty, so much that one is forced to sell himself into bondage. But even famous philosophers, such as Aristotle, helped to lay the groundwork for ideas that suggest that some people are naturally and biologically suited for slavery.
Aristotle would, in fact, give advice to the slave owners, such as when you put work teams of slaves together, mix up their nationalities. So right there you get in Aristotle, right there in Aristotle's Politics, he starts talking about how to handle slaves, how to manipulate them. And he also talks about slaves as being morally deficient and meant to be, naturally meant to be slaves. And if a man, through misfortune or chance, he recognized that possibility. Obviously, people must have raised the question with him. Wait a minute, what about somebody who just, his ship gets captured by pirates and he's dragged off the ship with his family and he's a Roman senator who's thrown into slavery? What are you going to... He said, those are rare cases, and those people generally show their mettle by simply getting themselves out of slavery. Once they're in it, you know, it's obvious they're not meant to be slaves, and they would get out. So he already had a, quote, scientific explanation for the naturalness of slavery. When you get to somebody like Cicero in ancient Rome, he would say the same things. He would say, Greeks and Cypriots and Jews and Asians generally make the best slaves. So they had these theories based on nationality about what is the natural human nature of these slaves.
Classical societies also believed in the concept called the Great Chain of Being, a natural ladder in which all things in the universe were ranked from most important to the least, with groups on the bottom divinely obligated to serve those on top. This concept later influences the attitudes about racial categories when Europeans decide to rank humans from top to bottom. Many Europeans also believed that individual behavior in humans was governed by the four humors, bodily substances that interacted with the elements of earth, wind, fire, and water to control disease and disposition. The concepts of the Great Chain of Being and the four humors were still widely held beliefs through medieval times and the Renaissance. In addition to these ideas, Western philosophers believed that climate zones could also affect behavior and disposition, and if one moved to a different zone, his mental and physical state would be altered. But when Europeans began exploring the Americas, beginning in the 1500s, much of these philosophies began to change. Europeans noticed that their immigration to the Americas did not change their physical or mental state as expected, and diseases such as smallpox that decimated native populations had little effect on Europeans. Also, the demand for labor to work new plantations established in the Americas caused Europeans to enslave people that they were not at war with, and this action required justification. The solution to these ideological conflicts was to embrace a mindset which suggested that internal qualities, not external ones, based on the four humors or the environment, were the root cause for the differences between Europeans and other peoples. And they concluded that the internal qualities of the European was superior to those of other peoples.
So they didn't go out and say, let's go make some colored folks miserable. We'll go look around and find. They went out looking for gold, silver, and one of their sources of wealth, of course, was people who would do the labor. So you not only steal their land, not only steal their possessions, but you steal their very physical lives too. Now, once that happens, once I come and I plunder your country, I murder your men, I rape your women, I spit your babies on bayonets, I blow up your home industries, I force you into an underdevelopment. You see, because these people weren't underdeveloped, they were developing their lives, their crafts, their arts. They were forced down by the European imperialists. And once I do that, me, the imperialist, I come in, I conquer. I've got to justify it. And the way I justify it is I say, well, you know, they're not really human. They're not like us. They don't want to really live well. They wouldn't know how to live well. They're very backward. They're very, not just poorly underdeveloped, they are biologically insufficiently endowed and developed, and therefore they ought to be treated as a kind of a species somewhere between human and animal, up there in the middle.
I have a book here, and I think that this book is really an interesting one, you know, that really poses the kind of question that was part of the European mindset. And you know, as you can see, the title is The Negro Beast in the Image of God. And this is a justification, you know, for the enslavement and the mistreatment of Africans, that they were seen as subhuman.
You reverse the role of victim and victimizer. the victims were a potential menace. This justifies your slaughtering them or enslaving them, and your greed and your imperialism, taking over their wealth and their land and their labor.
The chain links in the great chain of being moved dramatically, placing Europeans on top of the natural world and all others beneath them. During the Age of Enlightenment, Europeans began to embrace egalitarianism and to believe that civilization would march onwards towards progress. But that egalitarianism and progress was extended to Europeans only, and native Indians, Africans, and others were cast as inferior beings, incapable of progress and undeserving of equality. As the natural sciences began to flourish during this period, the stage was set for science to marry the notions about European superiority over the rest of the world's peoples.
The notion of race began from a physician who was simply trying to catalog dead bodies. Over the years, of course, it's become much more than just a biological or physiognomic descriptor. It's become a system designed for socially identifying individuals as well as trying to biologically identify their various traits and characteristics.
Suddenly race got elevated and it became an object of scientific study. And there were all these scientific studies in the 18th century and into the 19th century showing, quote, natural differences between the races and how the darker races were simply mentally deficient. Their brain development wasn't the same. Their moral development wasn't the same. They were savages.
Francois Bernier was one of the first scientists to classify humans into categories of race. His first attempt included American Indian, North African, Asian Indian, European, and Middle Easterner. He believed, like Aristotle, that humans had a soul capable of reason and non-reason, but that some were more non-rational than others and suited for slavery. The next to come up with racial categories was Carl von Linné, who gave us the following racial breakdown. Linné coupled physical characteristics with moral behavior. He had not traveled widely and based his classification findings on travel journals, not science. And, of course, he placed Europeans on the top and Africans on the bottom. The most significant racial classifier, Johann Blumenbach, in his 1775 book, Varieties of Mankind, gave us the following classification. We have Blumenbach to thank for the category named Caucasian for Europeans. But do most modern-day European Americans know the origin of this word?
Caucasian? No. So I do not know the origin of where that came from.
The origin of the word Caucasian, I wouldn't know.
Caucasian? No.
It was a region, but I don't know. That's as close as I can get.
I have no idea.
Blumenbach coined the term Caucasian because he believed that the women of the Caucasus Mountains were the loveliest women in the world, and that Caucasians were the original and the most beautiful race. In inventing this racial category, Blumenbach was also considering Christian mythology, which teaches that original humans must have repopulated the world near Mount Ararat after the biblical flood. And many naturalists believed that Noah and his family had to have been white, and they landed after the flood near the Caucasus region, a place many speculate is close to the location of the mysterious Mount Ararat. With African slavery being the fuel for European wealth in the Americas, there was a constant need to justify European imperialism and one of the most brutal slave systems ever invented.
Slavery really was an outgrowth of imperialism. Imperialism is when the ruling interests in one society go out and they expropriate the land, the labor, the natural resources, and the capital of another people, another country. And once they do that, they will often enslave. The Romans often went out and conquered just to get slaves.
I think it's really an important element to really see that it really wasn't about black people being scientifically inferior or morally inferior or inferior in any way. It was about taking advantage of an opportunity to make money, and it was about greed.
I don't believe that that the European conquest of the world, they didn't do this because they were motivated by racism. They did it because they were motivated by greed.
With so much wealth on the line, scientists of all varieties were more than willing to advance a theory that reaffirmed with the weight of scientific certainty that Africans were biologically meant to be slaves. Basically, these pseudoscientists invented diseases and maladies that rationalized the inhuman European system of slavery. One such disease was drapetomania.
In the 19th century, as late as 1850, you had eminent psychiatrists like Samuel Cartwright, like Benjamin Rush, whom we might have some admiration for in some respects. He was, for his day, he was doing some progressive things. But they talked about, for instance, they talked about drapetomania. And drapetomania, or maybe drapetomania, I don't exactly remember how it's pronounced, but drapetomania was a mad disease that slaves suffered from. It manifested itself as the mad, uncontrollable impulse to run away from slavery. And this, why would a slave in his right mind leave the security and comforts of the plantation, where he's bound with his master, who's feeding him and housing him and everything else, to go racing off, be seized by this impulse? And these eminent psychiatrists said, this is as real a mental illness as any that we've ever observed.
The fact that Africans wanted to run away from their slavers was an illness on the part of Africans. And I mean, it sounds absurd, and it was absurd. So they would make up these terms, like drapetomania, in order to justify their behavior, and say that there's something sick about a slave that doesn't want to be a slave.
Another psychiatric disease invented by Samuel Cartwright was dysesthesia ethiopica, a disorder that causes laziness and drowsiness in African slaves, but found even more so among free Negroes. According to Cartwright, almost all free blacks suffered from this affliction without some white people around to, quote, direct them and to take care of them, unquote. The cure? To whip the African with a leather strap and, quote, then to put the patient to some hard kind of work in the sunshine, unquote. Afterwards, Cartwright assures that the African will, quote, look grateful and thankful to the white man whose compulsory power has restored his sensation and dispelled the mist that clouded his intellect." Unquote.
Scientific racism was a manipulation, and it was designed primarily to assuage guilt and to justify the system of slavery that existed.
Scientist and U.S. President Thomas Jefferson, the man who once wrote that all men are created equal, was a slaveholder who also made pseudo-scientific remarks about the people who were making him immensely rich. Jefferson wrote that white people had prettier skin and hair, smelled better, and that even black people preferred to mate with whites over another black, just as jungle apes preferred to mate with blacks instead of mating with another jungle primate. Naturalist Charles Darwin, despite his immense contributions to science, did not escape the racist assumptions of his time.
If you read Darwin in his The Descent of Man, you find that he was a terrible bigot. Charles Darwin had a very strange belief about human development. He felt that the great differences between primitives in the Pacific Islands and the distinguished, advanced English gentlemen of his society, the differences were so great that they had to reflect differences in the evolution of the brain. The other person who had come upon the whole theory of evolution, Alfred Russell, actually lived with a number of these tribes on the islands. And he argued, I don't believe that's true. I found that among these natives, I found people who had a wit and a subtlety and a perception of intelligence that could match anything that you find in the British Royal Society, you know, the scientific society. Well, that was like shocking.
Like Darwin, several European and American scientists transferred their racism to scientific claims about racial classification and characteristics.
Scientific racism said that Africans were incapable
Racist scientists also developed fields of study that focused on the measuring of human bodies to assign physical, intellectual, and moral traits. Pseudo-disciplines such as craniology and phrenology were invented to measure head shape, and invariably, scientists aligned the shape of European heads with intelligence and morals, and the shape of African heads with intelligence deficiencies and depravity. No matter what the physical evidence, Africans were almost always on the bottom and Europeans on top. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy in the guise of science, which argued that heredity was fixed and unchangeable, and that Europeans would always outperform all other races in every matter of importance. Even after slavery was officially ended in Europe and later in the United States, scientists persisted with racist rationales for why whites were superior to all other races. One major development in this area was the eugenics movement.
Eugenicism is about the purity of a breed. It's about racial purity. Eugenicism has had a history that is all about trying to justify or rationalize the superiority of whites. But it's also designed to suggest that white individuals have not only this higher level, this escalated level of whatever, personality, intelligence, behavior, etc., but that because of all of that, we need to just kind of keep it in the race, right? And so none of this miscegenation really works. None of this mixing across the breed is what miscegenation refers to. You don't want to do that. What you want to do is actually stick within your own culture. But how do you secure that in a nation that is constantly, having more and more interracial relationships? And so one way to secure that is through providing scientific rationales for how individuals who are not white deserve to be ignored, deserve to be dismissed, deserve to be kind of dislodged from this sense of social normality. And if we can brand them and identify them as being abnormal, then of course you won't find them attractive. Why do we have to teach our children, or even consider teaching our children at a young age, about issues of race? I mean, why is that a constant paranoia or constant concern in our minds? And what I'm arguing is that it stems from this scientific notion of eugenicism, that it began when we started scientifically rationalizing and justifying a sense of superiority of whites.
Eugenics was a pseudoscience which argued breeding would advance the human well-being of society, and what we have to do is encourage the superior forms of people, the tall, blonde ones, to breed more, and discourage the people of color and lesser peoples. It was pretty much a racist theory, much in vogue, and very much embraced by the Nazis. It's gone for the most part, but there's still a residue of that kind of view in our mentality, I think.
Now it's time for my word. Do your duty. Make more babies. That's a lesson drawn out of two interesting stories over the last couple of days. First, a story yesterday that half of the kids in this country under 5 years old are minorities. By far the greatest number are Hispanic. Know what that means? 25 years and the majority population is Hispanic. Put it bluntly, we need more babies.
Scientific racism justified the horrendous treatment African Americans received at the hands of Europeans. Treatment which included slavery, rape, mutilation, lynching, and segregation. However, scientific racism began to fall out of favor when scientists and scholars such as Franz Boas began to challenge white supremacy and assumptions about intelligence and heredity. Scholars such as Ashley Montagu and Gunnar Myrdal both suggested that racial classification was a myth and a social construct. Although not all scientists agreed with Montagu and Myrdal, many researchers in the 1940s began to study racism and to promote tolerance. In the 1960s, with the civil rights and black power movements underway, scholars like Frantz Fanon began to challenge white imperialism and to link it to racism.
The whole idea of scientific racism, which is really what fueled, the anger of the civil rights movement, a lot of those people felt very justified in denying black people their rights, because in their mind they had been taught that black people were inferior, and the whole idea of black people standing up and asking for the same rights that they have was unimaginable to them.
So you have science being enlisted to service racism and slavery. And you even had sort of quasi-scientific theories after slavery was abolished during the years of segregation, you had social scientists who came forth and said the communities are better off if they're separated. Racial mixing, social mixing is a disruptive and chancy and dodgy kind of thing that is better left, undone and so forth.
As scientists learned more about genetics and biology, scientific racism became regarded as pseudoscience. And today there is broad agreement that our generic ideas about race are social constructs. And though there is variation in human beings, there is only one race, the human race. But even though scientists have, for the most part, rejected scientific racism and the notion of human racial categories, average citizens are far from reaching consensus that race does not exist, or how they identify what race they belong to.
Well, I'm not a scientist. I just know what they say, that as being a black person, I belong to the, I don't know if being African is a race. There's only one race though, isn't there? The human race? Yeah, I think there's only one race, the human race. There are various ethnic groups within that race. And I belong to the African ethnic group.
Scientifically, how race I belong, I guess the color of my skin and the background of my family.
I guess because I belong to Central America.
I guess the different traits that usually add up to a race are color of your skin, the shape of your face, nose, lips, and eyes, and I think you'd have to take all of those traits and put them together to decide a race. However, race isn't easily distinguished because there's a lot of mixed races nowadays, so I don't think you can purely go off of set definitions of race.
I belong to Asia Pacific.
Okay, so what makes you know that scientifically? How do you know that?
With my pictures, the way I speak with my accent, my Filipino heritage, Filipino Hispanic heritage.
I have no idea. Like, I don't know. Like the color of your skin, I guess.
It's technically it's supposed to be the DNA, right? But I don't know. The DNA is so similar on every level. It's really like the things that make everybody create the differences in the humans is so minuscule. It's like almost not even detectable. So basically, you really can't. It's like just somebody's like interpretation of it, I think.
I took an anthropology class last semester, and so I don't think you can determine scientifically. We learned about Franz Boas and how he determined that like the scientific evidence of like skull structure doesn't determine intelligence, and it's not really attributed to one race. And so from that, I would say that, kind of like Sophia said, there's so many different races, and there's, especially in the United States, such a mixture that you can't determine necessarily scientific, but it's more of a cultural construction based on like stereotypes or general groupings of people that fall under one culture, or social practices that determines the race of someone.
Not only is there not consensus on the notion of race among average citizens, there's also the repercussions of centuries of ideas promoted by scientific racism. Unfortunately, the impact of this indoctrination still lingers and remains a harmful problem for many, especially African Americans.
We cannot underestimate the power that those thoughts have, those thoughts of scientific racism, those thoughts that blacks are genetically inferior. There are people on this planet who still believe that.
Even in our lifetime, science has been used to justify treating people as moral and biological inferiors.
There are three things when you talk about scientific racism where it rears its ugly head today. There's still the notion of intellectual inferiority on the part of African Americans. Many whites still think that blacks do not have the intellectual capacity that whites do. We see that in schools. Oftentimes the argument is, well, African American students, they do so poorly, they're failing, they're chronic underachievers in school because they don't have the brain capacity.
What happens then when we have this presumption that blacks are non-intellectual? When we think that they're non-intellectual, then black people themselves, when they are taught this over time, they begin to get what we call test anxiety. Well, it has been proven by a couple of scholars, the video is one of them, who talks about how when blacks go into a test and they've been told that they have this stereotype about themselves, they tend to test very low. But when they are not reminded about the stereotype, they tend to test high. And so there's this reverse racism that happens along the way. I think that oftentimes when we have these kinds of stereotypes and pathologies, that psychologically we find ourselves reversing the trends or confirming and conforming to those particular trends depending on how they're presented to us.
Second area, crime and violence, gang violence. Remember, historically, when you talk about scientific racism, there was a strain of thinking that genealogically there's a predisposition on the part of African Americans to commit rape, murder, and violence, and especially rape, this attraction for white women, but always crime and violence. So even today, you see the justification because of the high crime rates among African Americans, high incarceration rate. So some imply today, you see, there's something inherently deficient that makes African Americans, especially African American young males, crime prone.
Psychological theories that have had their root in some of the same racist ideas that we've become so familiar with today are ones that have promoted what we now call self-hatred hypothesis. When we think about the self-fulfilling prophecy, right, we're thinking about that whenever someone has some stereotype about them, that their behavior then ends up confirming that stereotype, only when that behavior is negative. So for example, if I presume that all Asians are intellectual, that they're very smart, or that they can all fight, and I see one in a fight or someone who is trying to rationalize something intellectually, and I think, well, of course, that person is naturally being who they are as an Asian. But when the images, when the stereotypes are negative, when they're geared toward black men, for example, of being criminal or being violent, and we see on the nightly news that they're violent and criminal, then psychologically our minds cue us into those same stereotypes. So the psychological theories that are now trying to emerge and trying to address these same stereotypes are ones that help to reaffirm, help us to rethink the same set of prophecies that we have already had about black males or about other races.
A third area is media depictions of African Americans. There's still that tendency, despite Barack Obama, despite all the massive success of African Americans in politics, business, education, sports, the professions, there's still this tendency to characterize and negatively typecast African Americans in the media, the clown, the buffoon. And admittedly, many African Americans play into that stereotype with our images and depictions. But that's still there. There's still a subtle subtext that runs through some aspects of how blacks, the image of blacks, they are depicted in the media. So crime, violence, educational inferiority, media typecasting, negative. You can still see creeping in, once again, some of the old school thinking, the pseudo-scientific thinking about African Americans, that they are genetically inferior and that they can never perform on the same level as whites.
It's still the case that blacks are essentially the complete opposite of what it means to say that we have whites or we have normal Americans, right? And so that history is not going to go away anytime soon.
We come back to how many, and we don't want to overgeneralize, many police officers, how they see African Americans, how many store clerks see African Americans? How many taxi cab drivers see African Americans? How many of those utility persons that walk through neighborhoods checking things, gas, electricity, so forth, how they see African Americans? How job interviewers, when young African Americans go to apply for positions, how they see African Americans? Oftentimes, do they see them as individuals, job seeker, person on the street, homeowner, tenant, resident, someone looking for a taxi, drive, or ride somewhere? Or do they see them as a stereotype? Do they see them as a negative typecast? If they are filtering their view of African Americans through a negative prism, oftentimes based on negative perceptions that have been certainly dominant in society, in the popular culture, in the media, and in the thinking for decades and decades, you're not going to see these individuals, or that person will not see that individual as just another individual with some of the same attributes and same problems as any other individual, but as an individual. They will see them in a very narrow racial box. They will pigeonhole them. They will filter how they view them through the prism of stereotypes and negative typecasting, much of it driven through the pseudoscientific premises and constructs of the past. So as a result of that, what we see is we still see, whether you call it profiling, whether you call it stereotyping, whether you call it negative typecasting, to me it's all the same. You're still basically looking at African Americans not as individuals, but as part of a negative typecast group.
Racial profiling is designed for, I can read this piece of paper and I can know who these people are. And that's the point of racial profiling. And that flies in the face of saying, well, let me find out who they really are.
There's a very long line between the pseudoscience, stupid, silly kinds of things, self-serving things that came out of the plantation South that are still used today as rationales and justifications for treating the people a certain way. Because when you strip everything away, what we're really talking about is, we're talking about control mechanisms. We're talking about how you view a people, how you use certain mechanisms, whether it's all these silly terms that have come up from the past, exciting delirium, droptomia, and there was another one too, that blacks have a tendency to fall asleep. They can't concentrate and focus on anything. I mean, all of those things. For any prolonged period of time, to me, it's just a self-serving excuse to control another group of people. Because let's face it, if they're so negative, so predisposed to do negative things because it's in their nature and their genes and their thought patterns, such as those patterns are, then it's only one step removed from control. And not only control, but the most repressive control is necessary. So you construct institutions in society, both big and little, both overt and covert, both subtle and not so subtle, as mechanisms of control, whether it's education, whether it's certainly police, courts, criminal justice system, whether it's living patterns, where you can live, where you can't live, types of jobs. A perfect example of that is, why do we see so much underrepresentation of African Americans at the highest level in major corporations? Why for so many years in pro sports, pro football, did we see many say blacks could not be a quarterback, blacks could not be a middle linebacker? Because these are what? The thinking positions. Well, obviously we've seen that shattered a million different times in a million different ways, but it doesn't matter. Some of that thinking is still there. It hasn't gone away.
Unfortunately, what we're stuck with then is a lot of work of trying to rebuild and rethink this sense of positivity about blacks. Again, I do think it has to go back to the curriculum. I mean, I think that what we teach individuals in school is that European history, American history, is a series of battles and wars. What we teach them about blacks is that there's this guy named Martin Luther King. And that's essentially all you need to know. If you can say Martin Luther King Jr., then you're good.
Scientific racism helped to lay the foundation of white attitudes towards blacks. an attitude that even after slavery regarded blacks as less than human and therefore subject to all types of violent mistreatment. This attitude culminated in decades of lynchings and murders of blacks at the hands of white mobs. But despite the large-scale retreat of scientific racism in the minds of most researchers today, the idea that blacks are fit targets for white violence continues, especially among some members of law enforcement. And, like the self-serving fake diseases such as drapetomania, new disorders have been invented by some scientists to justify police brutality.
Much of what happens in psychiatry and in science as applied to ethnic groups, much of it implicitly justifies the racism and tends to blame the victim, like drapetomania, as we just pointed out. Drapetomania is blaming the victim, saying it's an objective condition they just suffer from. And we have it even today. One example is excited delirium, which is been used repeatedly now in police reports and jail situations where apprehended individuals end up dead in police hands, and the argument that's made is that they were suffering from excited delirium. That is, they got so agitated and so fear-ridden, and the police were trying to calm them down and all that, but they ended up dying. And these deaths in excited delirium only seems to take place when you're in jail. I think there is such a thing as excited delirium, but it's usually manifested by the police, where 4 policemen emptied 35 bullets into an African-American man. We saw the case right here in Oakland, California, where several African-Americans were handcuffed on a BART station. BART is the subway public transportation train station in the Bay Area, and one of them was on the ground, face down, handcuffed, his arms handcuffed behind his back, and the policeman took out a gun and shot him dead while he was lying right there on the ground. And we have it on film. Somebody had a little camera and was taking a picture, and he shot him. I don't know how to explain some of these killings, except that I do believe that a lot of these police officers are stressed, and that stress taps into their racism, their proclivity and predisposition to see and predefine certain kinds of conditions. And what happens when you toss in this horribly toxic potion of racism, this becomes a license to murder.
The theories of scientific racism also help to account for the disparities between blacks and whites in medical treatment, and the mistreatment of African Americans in many medical experiments.
You can argue that if you go back to the legal component, that black people being 3/5 of a human as chattel in the Constitution helped to justify this sense that they weren't really as critical as human beings. They weren't the same human beings. And yet over the years we say, no, we're not really saying that. After all, we all say the same Pledge of Allegiance. But still we find that there's not equality. There's not equal justice for all. And we find this within the medical field. So there are clearly medical atrocities that black people have undergone over the years. You hear a lot of folks talk about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Within that experiment, we learned that black people were essentially part of a trial group for a new drug that was supposed to essentially eliminate syphilis. And over time, this particular drug was something that they had to watch to see whether or not the effects were going to take place. So over a series of years, they found that people were dying. They didn't report this. They just kind of kept on giving them drugs. And there's been movies, and there's been documentaries, and there's been books. There's one called Bad Blood. And in this particular horrific event, this medical experiment, we found, once again, that black people's bodies were treated as less than normal, less than human. If you look at the Kaiser Family Foundation report, they reported that there were quite a few differences in treatment for black folks. They discovered that when black people went to their primary care physician, that they weren't getting the same kinds of advice. That when they had severe concerns or severe problems, they would either give them other drugs that they didn't really need to treat the problem, or they would give them no drugs at all. The maltreatment of blacks historically has led to a tremendous problem, a set of horrific atrocities over the years that we can't ignore, and that it's no wonder that black people are paranoid and concerned oftentimes about going to the doctor. And it's also no wonder that sometimes when we are disproportionately affected by diseases that are essentially preventable, it's because we have not been to the doctor because we're not sure we can trust them.
Science and race are still joined at the hip when it comes to marketing race-specific drugs, especially to African Americans, when there is no real biological factor such as race, and other factors such as environment, diet, and stress levels are better indicators for contributing causes of disease.
Your blood pressure's a little high. I've got something new that should help you out. Combines a nitrate with a blood pressure pill. It's targeted to African Americans.
Targeted?
Yeah, well, see, we tend to have nitric oxide deficiencies. And studies show this drug counteracts that problem. It's the first drug to...
What kind of studies are you talking about?
What kind of studies are there? They get some patients, they give them some drugs.
I've had white people lying to me for 60 years. I'm not buying into no racist drug, okay?
It's racist because it helps black people more than white people? Well, on behalf of my peeps, let me just say thanks for dying on principle for us.
Look, my heart's red, your heart's red. And it don't make no sense to give us different drugs.
I told him it was the white stuff. I gave him the black stuff.
He was right. You did exactly what white people do. You figure we don't need to know the truth or can't understand it, so you just lie to us.
Just a white lie.
Good one, Massa.
Although most researchers have eulogized and buried many of the ideas of scientific racism, there are still modern scientists who continue to cling to these racist notions. An example includes Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray, authors of The Bell Curve, which retracts eugenicists' arguments that blacks are intellectually inferior to whites and that the government should eliminate welfare programs that allow poor women with low IQ to have babies.
So with Murray and Herrnstein's book, The Bell Curve, they helped to rationalize the same thing. They suggested that blacks were intellectually inferior, that the IQ test would signify that they're not as smart as white people, and we had all kind of contestation about that. People were constantly saying, no, that's not true, no, how can you justify that? And essentially the book has been shot down in the last few years. But there are still individuals who would suggest that it's true, that, of course blacks are not as intelligent.
The Bell Curve, yeah, where they finessed all these IQ studies. IQ studies are another thing. An IQ study measures your ability to take IQ tests. That's all it measures.
James Watson, Nobel Prize winner of 1962, recently stated in 2007 that blacks were essentially not as intelligent as whites. And this is not really that surprising to hear this kind of thing happening from people who are considered esteemed scientists. We've always had individuals who were quite intelligent, who were very well respected. You hear, discussions of Thomas Jefferson and other major scholars that have suggested over the years that blacks were inferior intellectually.
James Watson, the founder, the discoverer of DNA, who has come out and made the mournful comment that it's a terrible thing that so much of the aid and such that's given to the African American is based on the wrong premise, which is that they're capable of a performance that's equal to whites. He has no evidence to support this innate inferiority of African Americans.
Race has not died away in certain circles, among scientists, among physiologists, among geneticists. There's always this search for the racial prototype, something distinct and different. Obviously there are different characteristics of different people. There's no question about that. But I think where it falls apart is two places. One, does that predispose a group to be inferior or less cogent than another group? And secondly, is that a justification for controlling that group? I think that's where it falls apart. I think there are differences, obviously, among all groups that we can characterize, but to attribute that to some racially defective gene or link, that's nonsense. That's been blown apart every which way. Having said that, still, it is correct. Whether you see census categories, you still see that defined. That has nothing to do with race. That has nothing to do with science. That has nothing to do with genealogy. That has everything to do with political convenience. That's all we're talking about in social engineering. And also, it also has a lot to do with, in terms of trying to find out or trying to categorize and make a map of demographics, population demographics and so forth, but that has political implications too. For example, if you have so many Hispanics, quote unquote, you got so many blacks in a certain area, then you have to, have so many certain things that you have to do program-wise. So I'm saying it has nothing to do with race, because it has no bearing in terms of science. But it does have everything to do with social and political engineering. But it does have everything to do with social and political engineering.
The idea of divvying up the resources, America's resources, according to race, is really vulgar. And it really is something that needs to end. We really need not to have, X number of dollars for Mexicans or X number of dollars for Asians, based upon a percentage. We need to have equal amount of dollars for the citizens of this country.
Many in the media have suggested that with the election of Barack Obama, the first African-American U.S. president, that we now live in a post-racial society where the vestiges of scientific racism have all but disappeared. But is this the case?
Well, the election of Barack Obama, the effect that it will have on the foundation, the principles of scientific racism, will be to diminish it. Right now, there's a consensus, even among those who didn't vote for him. He's a smart man. He's intelligent. Many people are saying now, I'm so glad to have a president who is smarter than me.
I wasn't that enthusiastic when he got elected. I didn't find myself overjoyed at all, because the whole election wasn't about race to me. It was about social justice and programs that were destroying this country and this environment. But, it doesn't address the life or death struggling issues of the African American community, such a high percentage of who live under or near the poverty line. And until those real crises and emergencies are faced, you got people who are getting kicked out of their homes or living out of a beat up old van or in some shack or something under a bridge. Until we really start dealing with the crises that is faced by the African American community, their schools and their hospitals and the human services, until that happens, I won't be dancing in the streets, When we really get a really reallocation of resources, and these resources are being used for human needs rather than war and madness and greed, then I'll feel more about it. That was my position. And then when I saw the inauguration, I saw these people crying and crying. Then it hit me, and I realized, there's a lot at stake here. There was a lot for some people. It meant so much, and that gave me a different feeling. And I thought, well, that was a good victory.
I think that the election of Barack Obama as the President of the United States is an amazing moment that we should cherish, that is going to go down in history, obviously, as one of the most significant moments of our nation. Do I think that it's going to mitigate, ameliorate, shift, enhance how we think about race? Probably shift. Will it actually change it to really say that we're going to now become much more racially aware, much more positive about blacks? I think in a small way there's going to be an enhancement. I don't think that racism is going to go away overnight.
We have seen stereotypes. It's just like the horror movie Freddy. Just when you thought you'd seen the last of him, you know, he's back again. Just when you thought you've seen the last of that stereotype, it rears its ugly head again. Sometimes unexpected places and unexpected times. I think we'll see the same again, even during the tenure of Barack Obama as president.
I have the high privilege and the distinct honor of presenting to you the President of the United States.
An editorial cartoon in today's New York Post is stirring up controversy. In the cartoon, after killing a chimpanzee, a police officer says they'll have to find someone else to write the next stimulus bill.
There is a long, nauseating history and a particularly revolting strain of racism which has compared black people to apes. It reappeared last summer and fall during the campaign, and repeatedly so. From cartoonist Sean Delonis and the New York Post, cops shooting and killing a chimpanzee. The caption there, quote, "They'll have to find someone else to write the next stimulus bill." The obvious reference is to Monday's story of the crazed pit chimpanzee who was shot by police in Stamford, Connecticut after it attacked a woman there. The inferences might be best illustrated by this T-shirt from the last presidential campaign, then Senator Obama as Curious George.
The mayor of Los Alamitos, California, is apologizing today for an email he sent. It's being called racist and offensive. You be the judge here. The mayor emailed out a picture showing the White House lawn planted with watermelons with the title, "No Easter egg hunt this year." An African-American businesswoman and a community volunteer who received the email says she was horrified.
A cartoon featuring a picture of Democratic presidential candidate Barack Obama on a $10 food stamp, surrounded by a bucket of chicken, Kool-Aid, ribs, and watermelon, was circulated in a newsletter to members of the Chafee community of Republican women in the Inland Empire. At least 2 members of the group are outraged and asking for a public apology.
The name is what puts this pastry over the top.
I call them drunken Negro heads. What's the problem with that?
Fox 5's Arnold Diaz confronted Ted this week about the cookies and what he allegedly said about President Barack Obama.
Don't you think it's like promoting racism?
No.
To say drunken Negro? I mean, isn't that an unflattering portrait?
Drunken Negro face cookie.
It just seems like you're singling out black people, making a cookie that has a very unflattering face on it with an unflattering name.
It's not unflattering.
It's not?
No, it's not. Look at it. I think it's a fun face.
He said these cookies are in honor of our new president, who will get what's coming to him, just like Lincoln.
Madam Speaker, the President of the United States.
Because remember, it's not just about one man changing anything. You know, it's about a whole culture. It's about a historical construct that needs to be changed. That doesn't change overnight. That doesn't change with just one person. Can that one person of significance in the march of time and events, can that influence change? Absolutely. There's no question about that. Nothing stays the same. But at the same time, it sounds like a truism, it sounds like a cliche to say this, but I think it applies in this case. The more things change, the more things stay the same.
It's not until we shift the way we have socially manufactured race that we're going to begin to rethink how we consider people of color.
I think we're talking about writing the final epitaph for scientific racism. I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that is going to be just a total done deal in our lifetime. And in the lifetime of, say, this generation now, 20, 30 years, I think there will still be some vestiges of that, simply because it's just too deeply inculcated, and not just older, those of the older generation, but certainly young people certainly have some of those ideas too from the past. I think you African Americans just need to keep doing what we've always done. We have come a long way. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Do we have a long way to go? Of course. But we have come a long way. Why have we come so far? In a relative, in human history, short span of time. You have to remember, the end of legal we're only one generation removed from the formal end of legal segregation with the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Act of 1964, 1965. That's a short of tiny, tiny speck on the sands of time in human history. So given such a short time frame and the fact we've seen the achievement level among so many segments of African Americans, and even a loosening of attitudes and thought processes among big segments of not only white Americans but other ethnic groups. I think that's cause for optimism and cause for hope that we have done so much to make change. What we just have to do, put simply, is keep achieving, keep marching forward, keep breaking down those barriers. And they're crumbling all over the place. Showing by word and deed and action. Achievement, excellence of all levels are certainly a part of our scientific DNA. As long as we can show that, then I think it will begin to break down, continue to break down the old pseudo-scientific barriers of the past.